120 feet down, in the freezing black water of Lake Huron, a diver's flashlight sweeps across the bottom and stops. There, sitting untouched on the lake bed, is a circle of stones, not scattered, not random, arranged. Someone placed these rocks here on purpose, thousands of years before anyone thought a human being could. For decades, archaeologists believed this was impossible. They believed the story of ancient Michigan ended where the water began. They were wrong. And what they eventually found beneath these waves would rewrite what we know about the first people to ever call North America home. Because 9,000 years ago, there was no lake here. There was no water at all. Where boats now cruise and fish now swim. There was open land, dry ground, grass, and a herd of caribou moving north with the season. Unaware they were walking straight into a trap that human beings had spent generations perfecting. This is the story of the Alpena-Amberley Ridge. A hunting ground so old it predates the pyramids, so well hidden it stayed lost for 10,000 years, and so strange that when researchers first proposed it existed, other scientists simply didn't believe them. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to understand why some archaeologists now think the biggest untouched piece of human history in North America isn't buried in the desert or hidden in a cave. It's sitting at the bottom of one of the Great Lakes, waiting for someone to shine a light on it. Let's go back further than most people are ever taught to imagine. Around 11,000 years ago, the last ice age was ending. Massive glaciers, some over a mile thick, were retreating north across what is now Canada and the northern United States, dragging meltwater behind them and carving out the basins that would one day become the Great Lakes. But those basins didn't fill overnight. For thousands of years, the water levels in the Huron Basin sat dramatically lower than they do today. And when the water dropped low enough, something remarkable happened. A long limestone and dolomite ridge buried beneath the lake for most of history rose up out of the water and became dry land. This ridge stretched more than 100 miles from what is now Alpena, Michigan, all the way across to Amberley, Ontario, in Canada. For a window of roughly 3,000 years, this ridge was a land bridge, a solid corridor connecting two countries that today are separated by open water and an international border. Picture it, no lake in between. Just a narrow strip of solid ground cutting straight across the middle of what is now one of the largest bodies of fresh water on Earth. And this corridor didn't just connect two shores, it became a highway. Not for people at first, but for animals. The climate back then was nothing like Michigan today. It was closer to modern-day Arctic tundra. Grasses, tamarack, spruce, boggy marshland, and shallow ponds covered the ridge, creating exactly the kind of habitat one species needed most: caribou. Massive herds of caribou, migrating twice a year, spring and autumn, using this ridge as their route. And where caribou went, hunters followed. Human beings who had crossed into North America not long before, adapting to a landscape that looked nothing like the one their ancestors left behind, found this narrow strip of land and realized something. If you control the corridor, you control the herd. And if you control the herd, you control survival itself. There was no store to walk into if the hunt failed. Okay, pause with me for a second, because I don't want you to just hear this next part. I want you to actually feel it. No backup plan. A missed caribou season didn't mean a rough month. It meant hunger through an entire brutal winter, for you and for everyone depending on you. So these hunters did something extraordinary. They didn't just chase caribou and hope for the best. They engineered the land itself. They built long lines of stacked stones, sometimes stretching for dozens of meters, forming what archaeologists called drive lanes, designed to funnel migrating caribou into a narrowing path with nowhere left to run. At the end of that narrowing path, hunters hid inside small V-shaped stone blinds, low walls just tall enough to crouch behind, waiting in total stillness as the herd was pushed closer and closer. This wasn't luck. This was architecture, planned, built, and used again and again, season after season, generation after generation. This is the same basic hunting strategy still used by indigenous caribou hunters in the Arctic today. And that connection is exactly what first put archaeologists on the trail of what was hiding beneath Lake Huron. But stay with me, because what happened to this place next is the part almost nobody saw coming. This entire hunting ground, this entire ancient society's infrastructure, ended up buried under more than 100 feet of water. As the glaciers kept melting over the following thousands of years, water levels in Lake Huron rose and rose and rose. The ridge that had been dry land, home, and hunting ground for thousands of years quietly disappeared beneath the surface. Everything those hunters built simply vanished from human view. not destroyed, just erased from memory, sealed under water and time. For nearly 10,000 years, nobody on Earth knew it was still down there, until one man looked at a map and noticed something that shouldn't have been there. Around 20 years ago, an archaeologist at the University of Michigan named John O'Shea was studying a bathymetric map, essentially an underwater topographic map, showing the depth and shape of the Lake Huron lakebed. Most people would have glanced at it and seen nothing but blue. O'Shea saw a ridge, a long, shallower strip cutting diagonally through the deep water, running from the southeast up to the northwest. He immediately thought back to what he already knew about the last ice age, about the dramatically lower lake levels of that era, and a question started forming in his mind that most scientists would have dismissed as far-fetched. What if this ridge used to be dry land? And if it was, what if the same corridor that guided caribou also guided the people hunting them? It's worth pausing here to explain why almost nobody had tried this before. Underwater archaeology is brutally difficult. Visibility is poor, the cold limits dive time, and searching open lakebed for small stone arrangements is like looking for a handful of needles scattered across a haystack the size of a small country. Most archaeologists simply assumed evidence this old could never survive or be found. But O'Shea had one advantage nobody had used this way before. A wave of new technology, originally developed for finding shipwrecks, was suddenly available to civilian researchers. Side-scan sonar, capable of painting a detailed picture of the lakebed by bouncing sound waves off the bottom, revealing shapes, textures, and outlines invisible to the naked eye. So he did something almost stubborn in its patience. He began driving a survey boat back and forth across the ridge in painfully straight lines, hour after hour, day after day, building up a mosaic sonar image of the lakebed piece by piece. Anyone watching from shore would have seen a boat going nowhere. What he was actually doing was mapping a lost world. And then, buried in all that sonar data, something stood out. Small clusters of rock arranged in patterns that looked distinctly unnatural. Straight lines, V-shapes, circles, the kinds of shapes that erosion, currents, and glaciers simply don't create by accident. O'Shea had a hunch, but a hunch wasn't proof. He needed to see it with his own eyes. That meant sending down divers, and later a remotely operated vehicle, essentially an underwater robot equipped with cameras, to actually confirm what the sonar was hinting at. And when the footage came back, it didn't just support the theory, it exceeded it. What they found wasn't one lucky stone formation. It was an entire hidden hunting landscape. Divers documented dozens of stone structures scattered across the submerged ridge, ranging from simple, small hunting blinds meant for a single crouching hunter. The structures went all the way up to sprawling, multi-part complexes with parallel stone drive lanes stretching for meters across the lakebed, exactly matching the caribou hunting architecture still used in the Arctic today. But even after finding these shapes, one massive problem remained, and this is the part that turned skeptics into believers. How do you actually prove that rocks on a lakebed were placed by human hands 9,000 years ago, and not just shifted into a rock-like pattern by ice, currents, or pure geological coincidence? This is the question that could sink the entire discovery. The proof came from the most unglamorous evidence imaginable. Not gold, not weapons, chipped stone debris, tiny flakes of rock, the kind left behind when ancient hunters repaired or sharpened their stone tools while camped near these structures. That kind of debris doesn't form naturally. It only exists because a human being sat right there working with their hands. Finding that debris scattered directly around the stone arrangements was the smoking gun archaeologists needed. It meant people hadn't just wandered past this ridge once. They had lived here, worked here, repaired their tools here, waited here in these exact spots for the herds to arrive. Nature doesn't leave behind sharpening flakes. People do. This was a workplace, a hunting camp, a home. Now don't go anywhere yet, because this is where the story stops being impressive and starts being almost hard to believe. Researchers didn't stop at simply finding structures. They wanted to know if these stone formations were actually placed with strategy in the smartest possible locations. So they brought in an entirely different kind of scientist, not an archaeologist, a computer simulation team. Researchers from Wayne State University built an agent-based computer simulation, essentially digital caribou, programmed to behave the way real caribou herds move, react to terrain, and respond to obstacles. They ran this simulation across a digital recreation of the ancient ridge landscape, trying to predict where caribou would naturally be forced to squeeze through narrow choke points. And when the simulation finished running, it revealed the predicted choke points, the spots where a real herd would have been funneled into the tightest, most vulnerable pathway. Those choke points lined up almost perfectly with where archaeologists had already found the largest, most complex stone hunting structure on the entire ridge, a site now known as the Drop 45 Drive Lane. Think about what that actually means. 9,000 years separate two completely different forms of intelligence. Ancient hunters reading the land with nothing but instinct and generations of accumulated knowledge, and modern computer models crunching data and probability, and they landed on the exact same answer, the exact same spot. That's not a coincidence. That's genius meeting genius across 9 millennia. Let's actually stand inside Drop 45 for a moment, because the detail here is staggering. It sits under about 121 feet of water, roughly 35 miles southeast of Alpena, Michigan. It's built directly onto flat limestone bedrock, and it's considered the most complex hunting structure ever discovered beneath the Great Lakes. The design consists of 2 parallel lines of stacked stones, running alongside each other and gradually narrowing, funneling animals toward a dead end, a cul-de-sac formed naturally by the cobblestone pavement of the ancient lake bed. Once caribou were pushed into that closing lane, there was nowhere left for them to run. It was a trap built entirely from stone and geometry. Along that stone lane, archaeologists identified 3 separate circular hunting blinds built directly into the walls, plus additional stone alignments believed to have acted as extra obstructions and blinds, corralling the herd even further. This wasn't the work of one person on one lucky day. This was infrastructure, built collectively, maintained over time, and reused across seasons. Now, I have to slow down for a second here because this next detail might be the most human part of the entire story. The research suggests these hunts weren't run the same way every time. Evidence points to smaller groups hunting here in autumn, likely working in tighter, quieter teams, while spring brought larger, more cooperative groups together to run bigger, more coordinated hunts using the same structures. That single detail changes everything about how you should picture these people. Forget any image of a random band scraping by day to day. This was an organized society with seasonal planning, shared knowledge, passed down through generations, and cooperative labor, coming together at exactly the right moments of the year to maximize their chances of survival. This is one of the earliest known examples of organized, cooperative hunting society in North America, and this is where I need you to really sit with the scale of what's being described here, because it's easy to let a number like 9,000 years slide past without really landing. 9,000 years ago, there was no Rome, no Egypt, no pyramids, no written language anywhere on Earth. And human beings were already engineering the landscape to outsmart an entire migrating species. Since that first discovery, researchers haven't stopped finding more. Over 60 separate stone constructions have now been documented across the submerged Alpena-Amberley Ridge, ranging from tiny, one-person blinds meant for a solitary hunter waiting in silence. The structures go all the way up to sprawling multi-structure hunting complexes like Drop 45, built for entire coordinated groups working together. And this is the part that makes this site almost unheard of in North American archaeology. On land, sites this old are almost always destroyed. Farming plows through them. Roads get built over them. Erosion, flooding, and thousands of years of human development slowly erase the evidence, one layer at a time, until almost nothing original survives to be found. But underwater, especially in the cold, low-oxygen environment at the bottom of Lake Huron, that destruction simply never happened. Once the ridge flooded, nothing disturbed it again. No farmer's plow, no highway, no bulldozer. Just still, dark, quiet water, silently preserving an entire ancient hunting landscape almost exactly the way it was left 9,000 years ago. That's what makes archaeologists describe this site the way they do, not just as a discovery, but as a genuine time capsule, a frozen snapshot of a moment in human history that almost anywhere else on the continent would have been erased centuries ago. And it survived purely because it happened to sink instead of staying dry. Now, don't tune out here, because this next part is the one that should actually stick with you. The Alpena-Amberley Ridge is just one ridge, one corridor out of an entire lake bed spanning thousands of square miles across Lake Huron alone. That's not counting Lake Michigan, Lake Erie, Lake Superior, or Lake Ontario, all of which had their own dramatically lower water levels during the same era. Researchers estimate that only a small fraction of the ridge has been thoroughly surveyed so far. Sonar mapping is slow, diving is dangerous, cold, and limited by visibility. Every single expedition so far has found something new, which means, statistically, there's almost certainly more down there. More stone structures, more hunting camps, possibly entire villages, still completely undiscovered. And this is the part that should really get you. This isn't happening in some remote desert or a jungle nobody visits, somewhere beneath the surface of a lake that millions of people drive past, fish in, and vacation on every single year. There's an entire buried chapter of North American history nobody has ever laid eyes on. It's sitting just a few dozen feet beneath boats full of people who have no idea what's underneath them. And that's really the heart of why this story matters. We tend to imagine ancient history as something that happened somewhere else, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in faraway lands most of us will never visit. But 9,000 years ago, organized, intelligent, resourceful human beings were engineering the landscape of the American Midwest with a level of sophistication we're only now beginning to fully appreciate. They read the migration patterns of an entire species. They calculated the exact choke points where a herd could be trapped. They built cooperative infrastructure, shared across generations, and adjusted their strategy season by season, autumn versus spring, small teams versus large coordinated groups. That is not primitive behavior. That is advanced, deliberate, generational engineering. So the next time somebody tells you that early North American history is a blank page before European contact, you now know that's simply not true. It's not blank, it's just underwater, submerged, silent, and waiting for the next sonar pass, the next dive, the next researcher stubborn enough to drive a boat back and forth in painfully straight lines for years. Before you go, I want to leave you with the question archaeologists themselves are still wrestling with. If 100 miles of ridge, surveyed in only small sections, has already produced over 60 ancient structures in the most complex hunting site in the Great Lakes, what else is still sitting down there, completely untouched in the parts nobody has scanned yet? So I actually want to know, and I mean this, not as a throwaway question, if someone handed you a sonar boat and one summer to search anywhere on the Great Lakes, where would you point it first? Drop your answer below, and if you think there's a spot near you with its own hidden history underwater, tell me, because I might just make that the next video.